Okay, I think we should get started. Welcome everybody for joining our webinar on visionary thinking in times of crisis. My name is Mark Johnson. I am a co-founder of Innosight, and I'm here with my colleague, Josh Suskewicz, who's a partner at Innosight. We are both co-authors together on a book that just came out this month called Lead from the Future: How to Turn Visionary Thinking into Breakthrough Growth. And we wanted to use this as an opportunity, as the title says, to to apply the principles of the book in an article we just wrote in Harvard Business Review on visionary thinking in times of crisis and why it's more important than ever. I think we would all tend to believe, short-term immediate actions are where we should be, heads down, dealing with all of the operate and execute issues of the day, and that's absolutely true, but we want to offer up a way that it's going to be important sooner rather than later to be planning for the post-COVID-19 period that we're facing, which over the next 12 to 24 months, it'll be critical to be planning on the other side, starting with vision. And that's what we want to talk about today. For those of you that, well, actually, before I mention the previous webinar, just a couple housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded. There'll be a link to the recorded webinar, as well as being able to share presentation slides from what we share today for you to peruse at your leisure. All of your lines have been muted. We will have a Q&A session later, however, and if you can use the Q&A function that's circled there on the screen, we will be able to take your questions throughout the webinar. And a couple times we'll also be sharing a couple poll questions, and hopefully you will participate in that as well and see what you think about the questions we ask. So just as I mentioned, for those of you that were on the webinar that Innosight sponsored with senior partner Scott Anthony about a week or so ago, his being called Navigating the COVID-19 Disruption. Just to summarize for those that were on and for those that weren't, he laid out a number of key principles or key thoughts to keep in mind about, from an innovation perspective, of what happens during a major point of inflection or disruption such as COVID-19. One is there will be a number of things that stick, that are changes that will be permanent. That could be something in the space, telemedicine, telehealth, different aspects of telehealth that could be here to stay. That innovation will continue to still happen. It will be all about operate and execute, but innovation still will be important. Those that make bold moves in the midst of a crisis, as an and statement, they'll continue to drive what they need to do to be able to react to the crisis and create sustainability, but also think about opportunities that can be in the midterm and the long term have proven to be successful in these times. And that in particular around the concepts of innovation and disruptive innovations, there's a pattern of seeing that there are a number of different entries into the marketplace that, as we call it in the disruptive terms, love the low end. Things like low-end ventilators that may be here to stay, especially to help emerging markets with this crisis, but that could be applicable for years past. And then finally, Scott talked about a process to follow as you think about managing the short term and the long term. First, of course, is to preserve the present, but then also to think about a rapid response strategy in the next, in his terms, 6 to 18 months, to be thinking about past that 18 months, where things are going to land, again, both in terms of the opportunity side and the threat side, but do it in the form of scenarios and scenario planning to be able to evaluate different options and implications based on, and assumptions that are based on that, depending on which way we end up coming out of this crisis. And then finally, own the future. How do you develop that North Star and think actually 5+ years out, which again can be very counterintuitive when you're facing the immediacy of the moment. What we'd like to do in this session is cover the process from own the future and actually working that back to how do you think about developing a rapid response strategy, or what we would equivalently think about in the strategy in the midterm, and principles along each. Now, just to set the foundation here, we want to share both principles that have come out of our book, from Lead from the Future, as well as an article that just published about a week and a half ago in Harvard Business Review, on leaders. Do you have a vision for the post-COVID-19 future? So those we'll be pulling from both of those in our discussion. Our hope is to share thoughts with you for about a half hour, and then leave the remaining half hour for us to entertain the questions that you have, which you can start populating now, and we'll work through those in the final half hour of our webinar. Let's start right away with poll question. So here's the question. Our organization has got its hands around immediate operational issues related to COVID-19, is beginning to think about developing a vision and strategy to compete in a post-COVID world. Here's the poll. If you could take, we'll take about a little less than a minute for you to fill in, but if you could start filling this in, we can see where everybody lands. Okay.
Wonder if we have a self-selecting group here. A lot of agreement with the statement so far, which is great to see.
Yeah, it looks like about 70% of you are either somewhat agree or highly agree. So that only leaves about 30% thinking that you don't agree with it or are neutral. Okay. I think that looks like it's going to do it, and yeah, it lands at around 70% are in agreement with that. Well, that's good. It's good. So maybe we can add a little bit to the specificity of that. Let me just get to put that away. All right. So what I'd like to do is common for us is to start with a story. So in thinking about Lead from the Future and what that's about, being a visionary future-back thinker, which we're going to talk about, one of our key stories, we have a number of them, but a key case example that we like to use, and people have heard this story a lot in general sense, and especially about Steve Jobs as a visionary thinker or as a larger than life figure. But I think the particulars, the details about the visioning process and strategy are not as well known. And I think it's also doubly interesting because as Steve Jobs came back to Apple in the late 90s and dealt with all the issues that was facing Apple, that then got compounded with the .com crisis and then ultimate crash. In the midst of that, he was looking forward 10 years out. In 2000, he took his top 100 lieutenants and he said, you know, we are going to look out 10 years to 2010, and we are going to get past all the naysayers who say that the computer is a commodity, personal computer is going to be a commodity, that we as the niche company are not going to have a future life. So they looked out 10 years and they came up with what they called the digital hub strategy. And that was a strategy, a vision to begin to think about how the personal computer and its microprocessing power could enable a set of consumer electronic devices, such as a digital camera or a CD player, an MP3 player, a smart device, so forth. And the idea was to enable these devices so that they wouldn't have to carry lots and lots of software and microprocessing power within them to bog them down and make them complicated, clunky devices, but that the personal computer could be the hub to empower them. So he had a vision to go past the personal computer and to be able to enable these electronic devices to thrive. But what's interesting is it wasn't just these devices that he envisioned. And in fact, he announced only those, the digital hub strategy in 2001. What he didn't announce, but that was envisioned in 2010, was that Apple could do these devices themselves, that they could design and produce these consumer electronic devices. So what you had now was a vision that was more than just some statement. It was literally a way that Jobs and his top group envisioned the future. They first looked at the environment out in 2010, again in the midst of a crisis, and they imagined what the personal computer's role would be in 2010 and looked towards an adjacency and being able to think about digital hub as an adjacent move to get them enabling these existing consumer electronic devices. But they also thought and envisioned their white space, which was to actually move into the consumer electronics world themselves and actually move into the music industry and other industries and transform them based on imagined products like the like the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad in 2001, and put that together to an imagined future. And that future then was walked back to today, or to 2000, where they began to build develop the capabilities and the plans for the iPod, then the iTunes store, then the iPhone, and then the iPad. While at the same time preparing all of the software capabilities that needed to be developed to enable the digital hub and then subsequent products that they would make. So it's a eminently powerful story about the power of vision, the power that it's more than just what I think often happens in companies is to create a vision and mission statement as a half-day offsite exercise, but that you actually create a vision of the portfolio of businesses and capabilities that would be out in a longer term future to become the North Star, to become the inspiration and the purpose-driven hope of an organization and its people, especially in times of crisis. Now, the fact that we're dealing with such intensity around the COVID crisis, the North Star is not nearly going to be enough, but its role is to provide purpose and direction and where you're going to want to land, regardless of what happens in the short term, having a higher order purpose for the organization, and then being able to then walk it back to the kinds of things that you would do today in the midterm. So the idea is to begin to bring to life the importance in sustaining growth, that we want to be sustainable, not just profitable, that absolutely we have to plan for the short term, and in this case, the immediate term with COVID-19, but we also have to plan for the long term. We have to be able to open up with the idea that the 5 to 10 year horizon is manageable, will bring opportunity, and most importantly, brings sustainability along with profitability, and that both forms of planning are critical for the longevity of an organization. And then once we think about the long term, and this is what our work with Lead from the Future tries to do, you have to bring the long term to life by developing an actionable vision that can be translated into a strategy, as the example of what Steve Jobs and his team did for Apple looking 10 years out in 2000. And then the final piece of the puzzle, and we'll share points on each of these in the next number of minutes, is once you have this vision to bring the long term to life and to make it practical and to make it actionable, it's important that you think in the right way and you conduct the process in the right way, which we call future back, in order to form that vision and then translate it into a strategy and then walk it back to initiatives, investments that you will make today, in parallel with the 90% of investments that you will continue to need to drive your core operations and the core growth of your companies or business units. So let me ask you another poll question. What is your company's traditional strategic strategy planning and forecasting time horizon? Again, we'll give you about a minute to answer that. Okay, it's coming in with what our research has shown. It's definitely more than 80% here that would say it's no more than 5 years for any kind of planning and forecasting. There's right now about 9% of you that say 6 years and above. And that's pretty consistent with what our research showed, which was 75% were definitely less than 5 years. Only about 5% ever looked past 8 years. So this is consistent. And
interestingly,
yeah, go
Mark,
ahead,
I'll
Josh.
just quickly add,
Yeah.
the conversations we've had out in the marketplace in the last couple of weeks, the reaction has been, well, with crises like this one, longer term horizons make even less sense. We don't know what's coming around the bend. We need to focus on the here and now. And as you'll see in the next couple of minutes, we think actually there's incredible competitive advantage in moments like this to be thinking about the long term and then tying it back to what we do in the here and now.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Josh. You know, and it ties a little bit also to Scott's webinar of thinking about things past COVID as opportunities, that there are going to be new normals. And yes, there will be things that are permanently changed to the detriment of companies and individuals, but we also find a lot of things get unstuck. Technology and knowledge development accelerates, and that leads to points of intersection which become the opportunity for innovation. And the challenge is, in order to take advantage of those opportunities that won't come to full fruition, especially if you're driving them mostly organically, many of those opportunities in our experience over the last 20 years take 5+ years more to develop. And we find that the only way that you can start to discern those opportunities is to spend time in that 5 to 10 year horizon. And we emphasize more the opportunity side. Absolutely, there are threats that you can see, early faint signals that you can start to pull in and start to think about points of trends, intersections that can lead to disruption or commoditization of your business. But we find that the greater piece that's missing in planning for companies is the opportunity cost that's lost by spending so much time in what we would call the VUCA world, the volatile, uncertain, complex world of the next 1 to 2 to 3 years, that these opportunities that are starting to incubate and develop, maybe through a startup or maybe through an early stage progress in science or technology, or maybe the potential to see the convergence of some trends happening, is missing out on those opportunities because leadership teams, more than I would say innovation teams, but leadership teams who, by the way, need to be a part of this because they own the resource allocation process, are not spending any time in that future thinking about what is the environment like, what are the implications of that environment, and what does that mean in terms of opportunities and threats for the business. Very similar to, again, the example of Apple with Steve Jobs and his top 100 lieutenants. So that makes the case for why looking beyond the horizon. I would also say that the power of looking beyond the horizon is it gets out of past the noise of the here and now. It gives the opportunity for teams at the leadership level, in parallel with the innovation team, to begin to see how new and different growth initiatives that are going to take more than just a couple of years, you begin to have discussions and how they'll play out, and it gives greater likelihood that there'll be commitment to those, while at the same time of driving what has to happen in the core. And I would just reiterate for perspective, we're not talking about this as being a big piece of management bandwidth or resource dollars or people on the teams. This is about putting 10%, up to 20% max of investment towards initiatives that you start today to plant the seeds for a hopeful future, like going beyond the computer to the digital hub. So that's the case for the long term. The importance of, as I mentioned, though, of bringing that long term to alive and getting it past what we would say escape velocity of all of the biases that drive us as human beings and organizations to want to think about things more from a present forward and more from a shorter term, no more than say a couple of years out. You got to have vision, and we have to, as organizations, get our arms around it. I will repeat myself. A vision is not, and that what we're talking about is not about a one sentence statement or two or three sentence paragraph that says how we will be the best medical device manufacturer in the world, or we will be number one or two in our different industries. The vision we're talking about is the literal choices that you will make in the long-term future, 5+ years out, because this is what gives the North Star. This gets past all of the noise of the volatile, uncertain world into the opportunity with purpose to drive to a portfolio of imagined and somewhat developed core, what that core businesses will look like 5 to 10 years, what the adjacent opportunities are, and what the new and different growth opportunities are, and formulating that into a narrative that drives the direction of the company, that in a time like this as a crisis gives the organization hope and purpose and inspiration. And by making it what we would say is a future state portfolio of the future as part of translating it into strategy, ultimate strategy, it's very specific, but it's more about the general direction as opposed to precision. We call the vision that you're developing an impressionist painting, not a photograph. But you want to, again, be more than just a simple statement. You want to be able to create a narrative. And Josh will talk a little bit in our case example of Johnson & Johnson and what they did in disease interception. As you can see here, it also gives the opportunity to get past the barriers of strategy, which are typically about how do you win an existing game, where vision can help you transcend industry and think about a whole new game that you can play, just as, again, Apple did to transcend industries with its digital hub and its consumer electronics vision that it formed in 2001. It defines the ends, the destination. It's about storytelling. It's about that inspiration piece, as I said, to inspire the organization. Strategy, on the other hand, is about the means to get there. It's the engineering, it's the how-to, the specificity of strategy and how you're going to do things, where you're going to play, how are you going to win, as Roger Martin and A.G. Lafley in their book would call it. Those things are very detailed over the next 1 to 3 year horizon. And that strategic piece is important, and of course is critical as we think about what the next 12 to 24 months are going to look like, with high degrees of uncertainty in lots of different ways that you could define where to play, how to win. The last piece that I'll share, and then I'm going to turn it over to Josh to talk more detail in the story, is now that we've thought about the long-term North Star of vision in a longer-term future, to find those opportunities as well as threats, and we've used the importance and have vision to be able to do it, it's important to think about how that's developed. It's very important that you avoid what we call the present forward fallacy, which is to just extrapolate off of the way businesses operate today, the rules and norms, the business model. You got to get past that and to begin to think about it as a clean sheet, letting go for the moment of the present and the past to take different capabilities into that future, potential technologies, and imagine them in whole new ways. Again, just like what Apple did. This is a 1830 photograph of the first train, of which people that thought about transportation and then had this technology that came before them, the locomotive, as you can see, they took the paradigm of the day, which was horses and buggies or horses and stagecoaches, and they simply strapped on those behind the train, as opposed to thinking about what are the new propellants of possibility. And as we know, the train ultimately looked a whole lot different. That's the key we want to do here. Another quick example is Goodyear, when it went into the aerospace business and it competed on a satellite design. its grand idea for a space station basically looked like an inner tube. We want to make sure that we think in the right way as we develop this vision, which is it's about what could be as opposed to what is. It's not going to be about facts and data as much as it's going to be about developing assumptions. We have to think in a clean sheet way and do our best to get away for the moment of the paradigm of today and the past. And it's very systems thinking oriented. It's not going to, it's meant to think through in a holistic way of how to core businesses and adjacent and new businesses come together to create this inspirational future for the organization. And again, very much that it should be purpose driven to drive it. So now I'm going to turn it over to Josh to try to bring this concept of future back home, not only about the way of thinking, but the process that you would follow as well. Josh.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And we wanted to illustrate the process for how to enact the future back principles through a story that comes from our friends at Johnson & Johnson and their quest to intercept disease. So this starts with Bill Hite, who for a number of years was the head of R&D at Janssen, which is J&J's pharmaceutical business. And Dr. Hite and his team were on a fantastic run of success. They were running the business with excellence. They had a series of powerful new drugs come out. Revenues were going up. Things were going really, really well. And what Bill wanted to do then was say, if things are going really well today, now is actually the best time to think about the future and what it means for us. And when he thought about the future, he saw both threat and opportunity. And it was all premised on the notion that our healthcare system generally is based in an age-old concept of break, fix. So things go wrong, we go to the doctor, more or less, and try to get them fixed. If we're lucky, we get diagnosed with a disease, and then there's a treatment to deal with the symptoms of our disease. So it's a diagnose and treat paradigm. And Bill and his teams are saying, what if we could move towards more of a predict and preempt paradigm? What if we could understand the earliest manifestations of disease, what might be going wrong, and then actually treat those before we get sick, and thereby avoid all of the comorbidities, all of the difficulties that we all know of as we age and get, unfortunately, sicker and sicker. And Bill would challenge his teams. He said, in the not too distant future, we'll all know the diseases to which we're susceptible. So most babies at birth will be genetically sequenced. The devices we all carry around with us are picking up all kinds of relevant health information. We'll all know our susceptibilities to disease. We'll all know when that susceptibility tips into risk. And then we're going to want solutions. We're not going to want to wait until we get sick and then try to deal with it. So what the vision then was to intercept disease before it starts with a range of novel solutions that target the earliest manifestations as opposed to then treating established disease. So great vision, it's exciting. We could all see it emerging. The problem is that that vision didn't fit neatly into a pharmaceutical business model. And pharmaceutical companies all are very good, in fact, as good as anyone at planning for the future. Their trials take 10 years on average to complete. They all think about the future a lot. They all manage risk very effectively. But it's all targeted at and within an industry construct that is relatively rigid. And if we're now trying to move earlier in the disease process, if we're trying to treat the early signals of disease as opposed to its manifestations, if we're dealing with people who aren't yet sick, who's going to pay for that, for example? How are regulators going to handle it? What are clinical trials going to look like? What are the products going to look like? So in essence, the business model for disease interception did not fit the business model for the pharmaceutical industry overall. And Bill and his teams were running into challenges related to that. So what they did was to say, actually, we have this vision. Vision on its own is the North Star, as Mark has been saying. But now we need to develop a detailed strategy to reverse engineer that vision back to today. And that strategy was based in the concept of dual transformation, which says, okay, core business, you keep on going. Everything you're doing is extremely important. You're highly innovative within the construct of what you're already doing. we need to carve out some resource and and be just as innovative in this new space. So carved out a little bit of resource, significantly less than the 10 to 20% that Mark mentioned earlier to start. But that resource was empowered to go beyond the bounds of the traditional business model. And that resource was protected, reported right up to Bill. They brought in fundamentally new capabilities. They took advantage of J&J's unique position of spanning the entire healthcare industry. So this was no longer just a pharmaceutical effort, but actually a Johnson & Johnson-wide effort. And then they were very deliberate about picking the areas most ready for this new paradigm. And they launched a series of ventures targeting disease areas that were ready to move, or most ready to move, into this world of disease interception. So Mark, if you go to the next page, if we distill down a couple of principles from this in terms of how do you actually bring this to life, the first critical step is to develop a compelling vision, to paint that impressionist painting that Mark described, to imagine, as Bill did, what the world's going to look like 10 years hence when there's this explosion of biomedical data, health data all around us. That's step one. Then step two is to walk that vision back to today through deliberate strategic choices. And those are organizational strategic choices, like carving out a group. They're where to play choices, like which areas to focus in, capability choices, how to build up the ability to do fundamentally new things. And then the third critical step is to not expect that strategy to then be implemented in all the traditional ways that your company implements and executes, but rather to very deliberately set up the organization and most importantly, the leadership mindset to nurture what will be, in many cases, disruptive new growth ventures. So we wanted to highlight these three important steps. A lot more detail, happy to get into this in Q&A and on our website and of course in the book. But first, develop your vision. Second, convert that to clear and actionable strategic choices. And then third, make sure you have the right bespoke infrastructure in place to nurture these early growth initiatives through the inevitable challenges that will come. So if we go to the next page, so much of this comes down to your mentality. And this is not about operate and execute. This is really about iterative learning. And that's at the strategy and vision level. And then, of course, it's at the innovation level as teams are working on these things on a day-to-day basis. But we wanted to emphasize that this is not a world when you're doing these kinds of things where you're going to have clear data and can make deliberate choices based on what the data tells you. Rather, in many cases, you have to actually go out and create the data yourself in a much more entrepreneurial mode, which involves first exploring, so asking big open-ended questions, doing divergent thinking, bringing in a diversity of views, then envisioning. So once we have initial set of stimulus, what do we think is going to happen? Can we put a stake in the ground on what our vision is, what our impressionist painting is for where things are going and how we're going to get there? And then finally, you actually have to go out and discover. You have to do the work to test your assumptions and then iterate. Because the only thing we're going to know at the start of these journeys is that we're wrong in a whole bunch of ways. And the key to success is figuring out where and how we're wrong and then iterating towards the right answer. So we wanted you all to keep that in mind as well. This, what we call the future back learning loop, will be such an essential ingredient to succeeding on these kinds of endeavors. And then a related concept on the next page is that we're all trained in what we call a very present forward mindset. The way we run our businesses, the way we make day-to-day decisions are by necessity very operationally focused. It's all about executing with excellence, making the right near-term decisions, following ordered and analytical processes, and using the data wherever we have it to be fact-driven. And of course, that's all absolutely essential for almost everything we do in our business lives. But when working in a future back mode, and then of course, as we're talking about today, when dealing with all the ambiguities and uncertainties of an unprecedented crisis like that brought about by the coronavirus, a different mindset is absolutely necessary. As opposed to operating and executing, it's oriented around exploring, envisioning, and discovering. The processes are much more organic, creative, and iterative. And it's really about identifying the assumptions you're making, putting a stake in the ground about the key hypotheses about which assumptions are right or not, and then rapidly testing and generating the data to tell you if you're moving in the right path. So this is a way of thinking. It's also a way of operating as a leadership team as you deal with creating visionary strategies, as you deal with the ins and outs of crisis response, and basically as you deal with anything where there's not an ordered playbook to follow. So I'm going to pass it back over to Mark to summarize, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thanks, Josh. Well, what I wanted to do was, quickly we could summarize what we talked about in the sort of outside the context of COVID-19. That would be anytime the situation is to drive sustainability along with profitability by thinking long-term and short-term, and being able to do that by being able to put the right kind of time horizon out there, make sure that that time horizon comes along with a practical vision in the way that we talked about, convert that to a future state portfolio, which gets walked back to a present day portfolio. That's the engineering that goes past the storytelling to be able to make strategic choices, and then make sure that that's done not only process-wise in a future back way, but as analogous to the train example, that the type of thinking is as important, if not more important, to be able to really make a clean break from the past to address any kind of discontinuities on the future. The article that we wrote in Harvard Business Review, which came out about a week and a half ago, basically laid out specific to COVID-19 4 key steps. First is getting your team, getting leadership, getting innovation teams, of course, and other teams to spend 10 to 20% of their time each week here sooner rather than later, spending time envisioning the future. Now that future, of course, comes much faster. And in fact, one person asked a question, you may be spending a lot more time in the future around 18 to 24 months, or whatever you think is the time that gets past the COVID-19 crisis. Points of inflection have moved up, trend lines have converged, potentially converged much sooner. The whole idea of looking out 5 to 10 was to be able to anticipate the convergence of trend lines and points of inflection and potential disruptions. If that all moves up, then your time horizon, which is considered well past today, can move up as well. But anyway, spend time in a explore, envision, discover kind of way in the future, and then develop a strategy that you can walk back from your envisioned future to today, and that lends itself to scenario planning. There's so much uncertainty that over the next 12 to 24 months, you're clearly going to have to drive a set of different scenarios, being able to think through what are the options and implications of each of those, and then bringing that back to what kinds of initiatives are needed today. Another question mentioned, well, a lot of these adjacent and new and different growth initiatives, most of those fail. And I think as across the board, that's true. The reason they fail is, and there's a whole host of reasons that we can't get into today, but one large reason for that is not understanding that those types of initiatives by definition are higher risk, and you can't pour tons of money on them and expect them to be developed to fruition in a short time. There needs to be test a little to learn a lot, spend a little to learn a lot, take these things in stages, because it's more about learning than it is about financial results. And this is essential in this time of what we're dealing with, but actually in any time, learning and pivoting is the key to this approach. Nobody has a crystal ball of the future. We're not talking about a perfect photograph. It's an impressionist painting driven by this sort of portfolio view that we've talked about. And you have to be able to, as you move forward with initiatives, some of them are going to work, some of them are not. You have to be able to test and adjust the portfolio of initiatives based on that, and adjust your vision. And then finally, rallying the team around your vision and communicating that is critical to make that successful. So with that, we'll go to some further questions that you all have posted. We hope that this has been helpful to you so far. Josh, you want to take a
Great, and
crack at the first questions?
we have a lot of, yep, thank you, Mark. A lot of great questions have come in already, so thank you all. We'll get to as many as we can, and yeah, please keep on posting them. So I'll start with one from David Hudson, who says, would you recommend that future-back planning is a separate event or an integral effort within annual planning, or both? Our perspective on this, David, is that you first need to do a heavy lift to make sure that you have a compelling long-term vision that speaks to the aspirations of the organization, that inspires people about where you're going and how you're going to get there. And then that vision should actually remain relatively constant. You'll refine it a bit as things change, and if things change in significant ways, you may need to revisit it. But once you've done the initial work to create that vision and the future back strategy that goes with it, then that essentially informs annual planning. So it needs to be baked into annual planning. Are we hitting our milestones? What's specific on the ground that things have changed or not changed that would have us tweak the direction of our future back strategy? Are there major new opportunities that we need to incorporate, major new threats that we're not addressing, and so on and so forth? So heavy lift to get going, establish a future back strategy, and then it's baked into how you do strategy and how you do strategic planning on an ongoing basis.
Great.
So thank you, David, for that question.
And one example of this is BMW, who's spending one day a quarter before the COVID crisis, but just with all the uncertainty of the future of the automotive industry, just looking into their future and discussing the implications of that with the convergence of electrification and autonomy and connectivity. Another question was, this all sounds great, but without cash, companies can die and will not have a future. Absolutely. Should a company have enough cash to survive the crisis before doing future back? Well, we actually call this the growth gap death spiral, and it certainly can be exacerbated, or in fact made just incredibly worse by what we're dealing with. There's no question, and we emphasize this over and over, if your core is not driving sufficient cash flow, you're not going to have the ability to be driving adjacent and new and different growth that gets developed from this future back process. So couldn't agree more. You have to drive and in fact invest. Part of future back is to make sure that you extend a healthy core for as long as absolutely possible to drive maximum cash flow. And then the other part of the principle here is, again, these are riskier. They get unfolded over time. So the allocation of the portfolio towards adjacent and new and different initiatives that are developed from this future back process are not going to be typically any more than 20% of the investment. Still going to be 80 to 90% core investment for both operations and for innovation.
Great. And of course, the allocation is financial. It's also really importantly leadership bandwidth, which leads into the next question from Michael Gherkin. So who leads and directs and executes such an effort in for-profit organizations and in nonprofit organizations? And what we want to emphasize is this sort of thing has to be led from the top. This is the job of the CEO, the C-suite, within a business unit context, the president of the business, within the nonprofit context, the leaders of the nonprofit boards can do this as well. If you don't have deep leadership engagement in the vision, the strategy to get there, the commitments and choices that need to be made in order to live into that strategy, it's just not going to work. So a strong recommendation to situate this effort as high up in any organization, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit, as you possibly can.
Great. I have a question from Mohammed, who says, so does Henry Mintzberg's model for, I think you're saying deliberate and emergent strategy, is it valid here? And that's a great question. It absolutely is. As Josh mentioned, the operative word here is learning. This is not about having certainty. It's trying to build clarity and insight and build a base of you don't know what you don't know, which comes from spending time in the future. The deliberate part of the strategy is, unlike scenario planning, which if it's just left at that, does not drive a North Star piece that's critical to help set the direction for the organization. So there's a deliberate piece of developing this practical vision and then converting that to strategy through portfolio development in the future and then walking that back to today. But the emergent piece, which is just as critical, if not more, is, as Josh said, you're not done. You just don't launch the portfolio and then fire and forget in terms of the vision. You have to allow things to emerge. Assumptions get tested and proven and disproven. Things get adjusted about your North Star based on what happens over the next number of years in the continued conversations that need to take place, not once every 5 years or once every 3 years for a long term. This is never one and done as we prescribe it. There's just too many things now that change in the world. It's not just the pandemic, but there are other disruptions that are possible, along with trend lines that move faster upslope than ever before. So that piece is critical. Another question I'll just answer quickly because it's right next to it from Rob says, purpose has been the buzzword for a few years. It now seems the perfect time to put this to practice. How would you recommend organizations balance purpose and profit, with tremendous near-term financial issues? Well, again, our view is in actually our evidence. We did a body of work, a research study on what were the transformation 20 companies around the world that succeeded and had the most success long-term and short-term, and a couple of them, like Tencent, which as a Chinese company said that it was going to use digital for societal good, or a company in Norway, Ørsted, which made the conversion from natural gas into solar-related energy projects. And all of these were demonstrated successes by articulating purpose of the organization. I think the answer is you have to show the evidence that purpose does work. Without purpose, the organization is not going to be inspired the way it could as part of developing this vision. And inspiration and hope are a critical piece for an organization in this time period. You absolutely need to hunker down and deal with the issues at hand and address cash flow issues in the immediate response, or what we call immediate actions. But this is going to be something that's going to evolve over months, not weeks. There has to be a North Star direction which can rally the team and give it the ability to stay the course as things are probably going to get worse before they get better.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Mark. So next question from ZS, a practical one. Are there any thought exercises or frameworks that you'd recommend for thinking forward on a 5 to 10 year timeline? So really important question. So how do you actually do this work of envisioning? And our experience, having done this for a long time with lots of different companies and lots of different industries, having done it ourselves for our own organization, is that we all know a lot more about the future than we might give ourselves credit for. So on the one hand, no one has a crystal ball. No one knows exactly what is going to happen 5 or 10 years from now. And of course, the world we're living in now, where I'm doing a webinar from my 2-year-old son's nursery, speaks to that. But we do know what the major trends are. If we just carve out the time to think carefully about what the future is likely to bring, to read widely, to talk to many different types of people, to interact with people who are kind of living in the future, VCs, startups, people in edge markets, if you will, to immerse ourselves in what could be, then we can pretty quickly come to bring together a picture of what is likely to be and what it means for us, and therefore where we want to place our bets. The keys are to make the time to do it yourself. You can, have guides and facilitators along the way, but this isn't the kind of thing where you can see one PowerPoint deck or, read one report and then create a compelling strategy out of it. But you really want to, as a leadership team, soak in potential futures, make sure you're having diverse discussions and points of view, and then converge on what you think the most likely future is, what the biggest trends are for you, and importantly, what it means for you. And then there's a whole bunch of tools, a lot more information on our website, for example. But one that I'll just mention quickly here is the concept of jobs to be done, where we don't look at product attributes and customer needs as a key to making decisions about what's going to work in the marketplace and where the future is going, but rather we think carefully about the fundamental issues, fundamental progress that people are trying to make in their lives and the barriers to getting those kinds of things done. And we find that the jobs concept is quite valuable for anticipating macro shifts in the environment and thinking about the future. So I'd recommend thinking carefully about jobs to be done in and around your industry as you engage in this kind of work.
Great, thanks, Josh. A couple other questions. We have about almost 10 minutes left, so I think we got plenty of time to answer a few more. These are all great questions. From Rob Mann, how does this differ from futurism and futurist practices? Again, a great question. You know, that I think futurists definitely have the time horizon. They're looking out 5 to 10, maybe even more years, and they are developing, you know, I know the Institute for the Future very well. They'll talk about future forecasts. If you think about it, that's step one of what we prescribe in developing your vision. You have to set a time horizon. I should mention, we say 5 to 10 year, kind of as a thumb rule. If you're a software company and there's rapid change, or as we talked about in this COVID crisis, maybe that vision needs to move up. It may be 4 years, or if you're a pharmaceutical company, maybe, or defense contractor, it might be 15 years. But the time horizon is the same, and the forecasting, if you will, on trend lines and points of disruption, points, faint signals, all those kinds of things encapsulate what a futurist would do. But the futurists that I know don't take it to the next level to say, okay, let's really dig deep, not just in the implications of the business, of the organization, you know, whether they're threat oriented or opportunity oriented, but literally putting yourself in that future and developing your best possible future of what you could and should be in development of, as I said, as you get ultimately into strategy of developing a portfolio, a future state portfolio of businesses and capabilities that you can define, that define together an aspiration, a financial one and one of impact, but that also give, if you will, a point of view about what's the mix of things going to look like in the future, to give clarity and begin to develop those assumptions that get developed by being able to do that. That's what I would say is the difference from a futurist versus us. The other question that's right next to it from Mark Russell. Mark, it's good to have you on. We go back in a number of different ways. This is probably a question around when you're in a company that's clearly focused and incented on near-term execution, how much effort should one expend on trying to convince senior management to think about the long-term versus going along with the culture of execution? Well, I think one is to give case studies. You know, Amazon is a relentless executor. There is no question about its ability to operate and execute and do it in a way that drives its overarching business model. But it's also the consummate innovator and serial business model innovator from a visionary long-term way, as Jeff Bezos professes. So there are examples of people like Jeff Bezos and Apple, Toyota and its Toyota production system, which is all about execution and managing process, but also has had big breakthrough innovations through its own ability to look out, like the Toyota Prius. So I think it's one, to show that you can do both. I think two is to be able to give a language as part of in the way of thinking, such as what we've outlined in the book, to say it's eminently doable compared to the case studies that we're talking about. And if none of that works, then, you know, I think organizations that remain short-sighted and relentlessly focused on execution without being able to look for its long-term sustainability are probably not organizations I would want to work for, especially in this day and age, you know, well before the coronavirus.
All right, thanks, Mark.
Yep.
See, another practical hands-on one from Javier Sevilla. Would you recommend creating a future-back strategy in a typical 1 to 2 day session or in several short sessions? It's actually, so as we mentioned earlier, first of all, this is not something that's done once and then done forever, but rather becomes a way of life. But when you're first developing a future-back strategy, actually what we recommend is a series of 1 to 2 day sessions. So I'll combine your two suggestions there. And the reason that we devote so much time to it is because, as we discussed a few minutes ago, you really need to soak in the view of the future. You really need a full leadership team together to be interrogating the major assumptions underlying the strategy. And then importantly, you just need time to get a group to commit to the major changes, investments, new directions that this kind of strategy entails. So what we found over the years is that a series, say 4 to 5, of 1 to 2 day sessions, we call them strategic dialogues, over a period of months, say 1 a month for 4 to 5 months, is typically a good way to think about this. There's a lot of work before and after each session to create the stimulus, to develop the materials, to individually bring each member of the team along. But the focal points of an exercise are in these 1 to 2 day strategic dialogues. All right, Mark, I think we have time for one more if you got one queued up.
I do. I have maybe a couple really fast. I wanted to try to go to, I should mention we've got about over 60 questions, so apologize that we won't be able to get to all of them, but we appreciate the enthusiasm. As 5 to 10 years is a long period, there will be many changes to the vision due to innovative technology business model. How do you make sure that while executing the strategy, you make the required course corrections to not end up on the non-relevant North Star? Again, great question. And just to reiterate, this approach, in order for it to work, has to be what we call a strategic management system. That vision is never one and done. You have to continually revisit it to make sure that it remains relevant and viable and you're not going to a wrong North Star. You're using that as the starting point for development of insights and development of assumptions. And so you have to continually have the relationship between 3 pieces. 1, that vision. 2, that converted to strategy and then walked back innovation and growth portfolio that comprises all of those different initiatives and investments. And 3, a relentless pursuit of learning on this explore, envision, discover way, that you're constantly trying out these experiments, learning from them. That ties back to the leadership team's learning process that they need to be on and making adjustments to the vision and keeping that relevant. And then a related question, how do you measure success? It's too late to realize 5 years later. The success is measured by the ability to successfully program and implement initiatives of the core, as well as initiatives that were developed from the future back about the new and different. And as those new and different become successful, and not all of them will, back to the risk base, but some of them will as you move forward to test and learn on them. It's measuring the success of those and then measuring it along the milestones that you've developed. That's part of the plan to get you to the future intended state. So with that, we're right at 1 o'clock. I just want to express my appreciation for this large turnout, for all the great questions. We'll try to get some way to answer these questions and get them put up on the site. Maybe not all of them, but a good portion of them I think we can follow up with to answer. Again, the document that we just presented will be available to you. This is recorded, so you have the opportunity to look back at this at your leisure. And we would reinforce that all of these concepts are both in our book that just came out, Lead from the Future, How to Turn Visionary Thinking into Breakthrough Growth, and that our article that just published in Harvard Business Review. Josh, you have any other final parting words?
No, thank you for your attention, and look forward to what you all create.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for participating.